Welcome back to another incredible story. If you're new here, this channel brings you powerful emotional narratives every week. Stories about family, secrets, and the choices that change everything. Subscribe now so you never miss an upload. Trust me, today's story will leave you speechless. Let's begin. Sarah Mitchell stood in her kitchen on a Thursday morning in late November, staring at her phone as if willing it to deliver different news. The text message from her mother glowed on the screen with devastating simplicity. Thanksgiving cancelled. Please don't ask questions. Love, Mom. For 42 years, the Mitchell family had gathered without fail for Thanksgiving at the sprawling farmhouse in rural Vermont where Sarah had grown up, where 3 generations would crowd around the massive dining table her grandfather had built, where the scent of roasting turkey and her mother's famous pecan pie would fill every corner of the house. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reread the message, her mind racing through possibilities. Her mother, Elizabeth Mitchell, was the family's anchor, the woman who had held them together through her husband's death 10 years ago, through Sarah's divorce, through her brother Daniel's struggles with addiction, through every crisis and celebration. Elizabeth didn't cancel Thanksgiving. She didn't send cryptic messages asking people not to question her decisions. Something was terribly, devastatingly wrong, and Sarah felt a cold dread settle in her stomach as she realized that whatever had happened behind the closed doors of that Vermont farmhouse was about to shatter everything she believed about her family. She grabbed her car keys, called her assistant to cancel her afternoon meetings at the architectural firm where she worked, and began the 3-hour drive north from Boston, her mind spinning with scenarios, each more frightening than the last, completely unaware that the truth waiting for her would be more shocking than anything she could possibly imagine. The November landscape blurred past Sarah's windshield as she drove north on Interstate 89, bare trees standing like skeletal sentinels against a gray sky that threatened snow. She had tried calling her mother 6 times, each call going straight to voicemail. She had texted her younger brother Daniel, her older sister Rebecca, and received similar confused responses. Rebecca, who lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 teenagers, had received the same message and was already booking a flight. Daniel, who had been living in the guest cottage on their mother's property for the past year while he rebuilt his life after rehab, hadn't responded at all, which worried Sarah more than anything. Her brother had been sober for 14 months, the longest stretch of sobriety he'd achieved since his addiction to opioids began after a construction accident 7 years ago. The family had walked on eggshells around Daniel, terrified that any stress or conflict might trigger a relapse. Sarah's ex-husband, Marcus, had once accused her of caring more about protecting her brother than building their own life together, a criticism that had stung because it held a kernel of truth. The Mitchell family had always circled the wagons around their own, protecting each other sometimes at the cost of honest communication. But this felt different. This wasn't about protecting Daniel or maintaining the illusion of family harmony. This was about something fundamental breaking, some fault line that had finally given way after years of pressure. Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator, anxiety tightening like a band around her chest. When she finally turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the farmhouse, she noticed immediately that something was off. Her mother's car was there and Daniel's truck, but there was also an unfamiliar silver sedan parked near the barn. Sarah parked and approached the house, noting that the curtains were drawn in the living room, unusual for midday. She knocked, then used her key when no one answered. The house was silent in a way that felt oppressive, heavy with unspoken tension. "Mom," Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the familiar entryway where family photos lined the walls, decades of Thanksgiving memories captured in frames. "Daniel, is anyone home?" She heard movement from the study, the small room off the main hallway where her father used to manage the farm's accounts. The door opened and her mother emerged, and Sarah felt her breath catch. Elizabeth Mitchell had aged a decade in the weeks since Sarah had last seen her. Her mother's face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her normally impeccable appearance disheveled. Behind her, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor stepped into the hallway. "Sarah, honey," Elizabeth said, her voice cracking. "I didn't expect you to drive up. I asked you not to." "Mom, what's going on?" "Who is this?" Sarah interrupted, looking between her mother and the stranger. The man extended his hand. "I'm Dr. Richard Ashford, Mrs. Mitchell's oncologist. Perhaps we should all sit down." Oncologist. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. Cancer. Her mother had cancer, and she hadn't told any of them. That's why Thanksgiving was cancelled. Elizabeth must be sick, probably very sick, and she had kept it secret rather than burden her children. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, even as relief flooded through her. It was terrible news, devastating news, but it was also something they could face together, something they could fight as a family. Cancer was awful, but it wasn't the family-destroying catastrophe she had imagined during the long drive. "Oh, Mom," Sarah said, moving to embrace her mother. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have been there for your appointments. We could have—" "Sarah, stop," Elizabeth said sharply, pulling back. "Dr. Ashford isn't here for me. He's here about your father." Sarah froze. "Dad? But Dad's been dead for 10 years. He had a heart attack. What does his death have to do with—" "Your father didn't die of a heart attack, Sarah," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father is alive. He's upstairs, and he's dying now for real this time." The world tilted sideways. Sarah grabbed the wall for support, her mind unable to process what her mother had just said. Her father, James Mitchell, had died 10 years ago on a business trip to Montreal. Heart attack, sudden and massive. They had held a memorial service because the Canadian authorities had already handled the cremation, due to some bureaucratic mix-up that Elizabeth had been too grief-stricken to contest. Sarah had mourned him, had spent years working through the grief, had finally reached a place of acceptance. And now her mother was standing here saying it had all been a lie? "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. "We buried his ashes. I spoke at his memorial. You've been a widow for a decade. This doesn't make any sense." Elizabeth's face crumpled. I know how insane this sounds, but it's true. Your father didn't die in Montreal. He disappeared, and he let us believe he was dead because he was running from something terrible. Something I only discovered 3 weeks ago when he showed up at the door in the middle of the night. Sick and desperate. Dr. Ashford cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps I should give you some privacy. Mrs. Mitchell, I'll be back tomorrow to check on James. In the meantime, continue the morphine as directed. Make him comfortable. Given the progression of the cancer, I'd estimate he has perhaps a week, maybe less. Cancer." Her supposedly dead father was upstairs dying of cancer. Sarah felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. After Dr. Ashford left, Elizabeth led Sarah into the living room and began to explain, her words tumbling out in a confession that had clearly been weighing on her for weeks. 10 years ago, James Mitchell had indeed gone to Montreal on business. He worked for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. Nothing glamorous, but solid work that had supported the family well. What Elizabeth and the children never knew was that James had discovered something at work, something that would eventually make national news. His company was knowingly distributing contaminated medication that was causing serious side effects, even deaths, and covering it up to avoid a recall that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. James had collected evidence, had planned to go to federal regulators, but before he could act, someone at the company discovered his intentions. They made it clear that if he spoke up, he wouldn't just lose his job. He would have an accident. His family might have accidents too. So James made an impossible choice. He ran, staging his death in Montreal with the help of a former colleague who owed him a favor, letting his family believe he was gone rather than putting them in danger by staying or by becoming a whistleblower. For 10 years, he's been living under a different name, working odd jobs, moving every few months, Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face. He never contacted us because he thought they were watching, thought any connection to his old life would put us at risk. Then 3 weeks ago, he got diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He knew he was dying, and he couldn't die alone, couldn't die without telling us the truth. So he came home. Sarah felt numb, her emotions cycling too rapidly to process. Shock, anger, grief, confusion, disbelief. Why didn't you tell us immediately? Why did you keep this secret for 3 weeks? Because he made me promise, Elizabeth said. He didn't want you kids to see him like this. Didn't want your last memories of him to be watching him waste away. He wanted to just slip away quietly, and then I could tell you the truth after. But then Thanksgiving started approaching, and I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't host Thanksgiving. Couldn't pretend everything was normal while your father was upstairs dying. I couldn't keep lying to you all, so I cancelled it. But I didn't know how to explain without explaining everything. I want to see him, Sarah said, standing abruptly. Elizabeth hesitated. Sarah, he's very sick. He looks nothing like you remember. The cancer has... I don't care. He's my father, and he's been alive this whole time, and I want to see him. Now. Elizabeth nodded slowly and led Sarah upstairs to what had once been the master bedroom. When Elizabeth opened the door, Sarah had to suppress a gasp. The man in the bed was a ghost of James Mitchell. He'd lost at least 60 pounds. His skin had a greyish pallor, and his once robust frame was now skeletal. But his eyes, when they opened and focused on Sarah, were still her father's eyes. "Sunshine," he whispered, using his old nickname for her. "I'm so sorry." Sarah approached the bed slowly, her anger and confusion momentarily overwhelmed by the simple reality of seeing her father alive after a decade of believing him dead. She sat in the chair beside his bed, reaching for his hand, which felt fragile as bird bones in her grip. "Dad, I don't understand any of this. Why didn't you trust us? Why didn't you let us help?" James closed his eyes, his breath labored. "Because I loved you too much. The people I was dealing with, Sarah, they were dangerous. They had already made attempts on my life, looked like accidents. A car with faulty brakes, a gas leak in my hotel room. If I had stayed, if I had fought them publicly, they would have come after your mother, you, Rebecca, Daniel. I couldn't risk that. So I took the coward's way out. I ran, and I let you grieve me, and I've lived with that guilt every single day since." Sarah sat with her father for an hour, listening to him explain the decade he had spent in hiding, the loneliness, the constant fear, the ways he had found to keep tabs on his family from a distance. He had known about Daniel's accident and addiction, about Sarah's divorce, about Rebecca's daughter's scholarship to Columbia. He had watched their lives unfold through careful internet searches and occasional glimpses from a distance, never daring to make direct contact. "Did the medication company ever face consequences?" Sarah asked. James nodded weakly. 3 years after I left, another employee came forward with similar evidence. There was an investigation, recalls, lawsuits, the whole thing. The CEO went to prison. By then I'd been dead for so long, I didn't know how to come back. How do you resurrect yourself after 3 years? After 5? After 10? So I stayed dead. And I told myself it was for the best, that you'd all moved on. When Sarah finally left the bedroom, she found Daniel waiting in the hallway. Her brother looked shattered, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Mom told me," he said simply. I don't know how to process this, Sarah. He's been alive this whole time. I got addicted to pain pills, lost my job, lost my marriage, and he was alive and didn't even reach out." Sarah pulled her brother into a hug, feeling him shake with silent sobs. "I know, it's insane. It's unforgivable. It's also complicated in ways I'm still trying to understand." Over the next few days, Rebecca arrived from Seattle, and the 3 siblings took turns sitting with their father, listening to his stories, asking questions, cycling through anger and forgiveness and grief all over again. Elizabeth moved through the house like a woman in a trance, caring for her husband with a tenderness that spoke of complicated love, betrayal, and a loyalty that transcended a decade of deception. On what would have been Thanksgiving Day, the family gathered in James's bedroom rather than around the dining table. Elizabeth brought up plates of the traditional meal, and they ate quietly while James dozed, the morphine keeping him comfortable, but also pulling him further from consciousness. I still don't understand why he didn't just go to the FBI or something, Rebecca said, her voice tight with anger. There are witness protection programs, ways to handle corporate whistleblowers. He didn't have to disappear and let us think he was dead. Elizabeth set down her fork. There's more to the story. Something your father made me promise not to tell you, but I think you deserve to know everything now. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What else could there possibly be? Elizabeth took a deep breath. The pharmaceutical company your father worked for. He wasn't just a random employee who stumbled onto their crimes. He was part of it. For 2 years, he knew about the contaminated medication and said nothing because they were paying him to stay quiet. He took bribes, substantial ones, money that helped pay for Rebecca's college, for the new barn, for Daniel's rehab the first time. When he finally developed a conscience and decided to come forward, it wasn't just about being a whistleblower. He was also confessing to being complicit in covering up deaths caused by medication he knew was dangerous. The room fell silent except for James's labored breathing. Sarah felt like she'd been punched. Her father wasn't a hero who had sacrificed everything to protect his family. He was a man who had profited from corporate malfeasance and then run when the consequences finally caught up with him. How much money? Daniel asked quietly. Enough that we never questioned where it came from, Elizabeth replied. $200,000 over 2 years, paid in ways that seemed legitimate. Bonuses, consulting fees. I didn't know until he came back and told me everything. The guilt over those people who died from the medication, over his role in covering it up. It's eaten him alive for 10 years. That's really why he stayed away. He didn't think he deserved to come back. Rebecca stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly. So we've been mourning a man who faked his death to avoid prison? Who let his family suffer for a decade because he was too much of a coward to face the consequences of his actions? And we're supposed to what, forgive him because he's dying now? I don't know what we're supposed to do, Sarah said honestly. But he's still our father, and he has days left. We can figure out how to feel about all of this after, but Rebecca was already walking toward the door. I'm going back to Seattle. I came here thinking Mom was sick. Then I found out Dad was miraculously alive, and now I find out he's actually just a criminal who destroyed our family to save himself. I can't do this. I can't sit here and pretend this is some touching reunion. She stopped at the doorway, turning back. You know what the worst part is? All those years I mourned him. All the times I wished I could talk to him about my kids or my career or just hear his voice. He was alive the whole time, living under some fake name, and he chose not to be part of our lives. That's not sacrifice. That's abandonment. She left, and they heard her car start moments later, gravel crunching as she drove away. Daniel stood too, but instead of leaving, he walked into James's room. Sarah and Elizabeth followed, watching as Daniel approached the bed where his father lay sleeping. Dad, Daniel said loudly, waking James from his morphine haze. Dad, I need to know something. When I had my accident, when I got addicted to pills and lost everything, were you watching? Did you know? James's eyes focused on his son with difficulty. Yes, I knew. I read about your accident online, followed the court cases from your DUI, saw your name in the rehab facility's visitor log when your mother posted pictures on social media. And you didn't think, maybe my son needs me. Maybe I should reach out, help him, be there for him. Daniel's voice was rising, anger finally breaking through shock. Maybe I stayed away because I knew what I was, James said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. I knew I was a liar and a coward, and I thought you were better off with a dead father you could respect than a living one who would only disappoint you. You don't get to make that choice. Daniel shouted. You don't get to decide what's better for us. I needed my father and you weren't there, and I almost died because I couldn't handle the pain and the grief and the guilt. And you were alive the whole time." James closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners. "I know, I'm sorry. I know sorry isn't enough. I know I can't fix what I've broken. But I am sorry, son, for all of it. For the lies, for the abandonment, for not being the man you deserved as a father." Daniel stood there for a long moment, his whole body tense with emotion. Then unexpectedly he sat down on the edge of the bed. "I'm an addict," he said quietly. "I've hurt people, lied to people, stolen from people I love to feed my addiction. I've done things I'm ashamed of, things I can't take back. So I understand a little bit about making terrible choices and having to live with them. I don't forgive you, not yet, maybe not ever. But I understand being broken and making the wrong calls because you can't see past your own fear." Father and son sat in silence for a moment, not quite reconciled, but perhaps reaching something like mutual understanding. Sarah watched them and felt something shift in her own heart. Her father had made catastrophic choices, had damaged his family in ways that might never fully heal. But he was still human, still flawed and frightened and imperfect, just like all of them. Over the next 3 days, James Mitchell faded rapidly. Rebecca returned from Seattle, unable to stay away despite her anger. The 3 siblings and their mother took turns maintaining vigil, sharing stories, arguing, crying, and slowly beginning the complicated process of grieving not the idealized father they had mourned 10 years ago, but the flawed, complicated man who was leaving them now. On the 4th day after Sarah's arrival, James died peacefully in his sleep with Elizabeth holding his hand. The family made the strange decision to hold a second memorial service, this time acknowledging the truth of who James Mitchell had been, not a victim of a sudden heart attack, but a man who had made terrible choices and paid for them with a decade of exile and loneliness. They invited only a handful of close friends, and Sarah insisted they tell the truth. "He spent 10 years hiding and lying," she said. "He deserves to be remembered as he actually was, not as some fictional version we create to make ourselves feel better." At the small service, Daniel spoke about addiction, about the ways fear and shame can make people do unthinkable things, about the long road to redemption and how his father had run out of time before he could complete it. Rebecca spoke about anger and forgiveness, about how both can coexist, about how loving someone doesn't require pretending they were perfect. Sarah spoke about the complexity of human nature, about how people can be simultaneously selfish and self-sacrificing, cowardly and courageous, and how their family would spend years unpacking the impact of their father's choices. Elizabeth, surprisingly, spoke last. "James Mitchell was not a good man," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He was complicit in covering up deaths caused by corporate negligence. He took money to stay silent. When consequences came for him, he ran rather than face them. And he let his family grieve him for 10 years rather than find the courage to face us. But he was also a man who loved his children, who spent a decade in exile partly to protect them, who lived with guilt that destroyed him from the inside out, and who came home to die because he couldn't leave this world without telling the truth. I don't know if that balances the scales. I don't know if love and guilt and belated honesty can redeem a decade of lies. But I know that judging him doesn't heal us, and neither does pretending he was something he wasn't. So I choose to remember him as complicated, flawed, human, and gone." After the service, as the family gathered back at the farmhouse, Sarah found herself in the study looking at old photos. Daniel joined her, and then Rebecca, and then Elizabeth, and they sat together looking at images of their father from before his disappearance, trying to reconcile the smiling man in the photographs with the complicated reality they now understood. "Are we going to tell people?" Rebecca asked. "About the real reason he disappeared, about the bribes, about all of it?" Elizabeth shook her head. "The pharmaceutical company already faced consequences. The people responsible are in prison. Dragging James's name through the mud now won't serve any purpose, except maybe making us feel like we're being honest. And I think we've had enough radical honesty for one lifetime. So we keep secrets, just like he did," Daniel observed. "Maybe," Sarah said. Or maybe we just choose what truths serve a purpose, and what truths just cause pain for no good reason. As winter settled over Vermont, the Mitchell family began the slow process of rebuilding. Rebecca returned to Seattle, but called more often, working through her anger in therapy and in long conversations with her siblings. Daniel moved out of the guest cottage and into a small apartment in town, ready to build a life that was truly his own, rather than one dependent on his mother's support. Sarah continued her work in Boston, but came home more frequently, recognizing that family connections required active maintenance, not just good intentions. Elizabeth, surprisingly, seemed lighter than she had in years. I spent a decade mourning James, she told Sarah during one visit. Then I spent 3 weeks caring for him while carrying the weight of his secrets. Now that he's really gone, now that all the truth is out, I feel like I can finally breathe. The grief is real, but it's not complicated by lies anymore. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside, Sarah sat in the farmhouse kitchen with her mother, drinking tea and watching the fire. "Do you think we'll ever have a normal Thanksgiving again?" Sarah asked. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "I don't know if our Thanksgivings were ever really normal, honey. We just thought they were because we didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. Maybe the best we can hope for is honest Thanksgivings, where we gather knowing that every family has complications and secrets and imperfect people just trying to do their best." "That's a depressing standard for family celebrations," Sarah observed. "Maybe," Elizabeth agreed. "But it's more honest than pretending we're something we're not. Your father's greatest sin wasn't the mistakes he made. It was believing he had to hide them, believing he had to protect us from the truth, rather than trusting us to handle it together. I don't want to repeat that mistake. So yes, we'll have Thanksgiving again, and it might be messy and complicated, and we'll probably argue about your father's memory and what it all means. But we'll do it honestly, behind doors that aren't closed anymore." Sarah thought about that, about the strange journey from the cancelled Thanksgiving to this moment, about discovering her father was alive only to lose him again, about learning uncomfortable truths that shattered her understanding of her family's history. It had been devastating, disorienting, and painful, but her mother was right. There was something clarifying about it too, something that felt like a foundation being rebuilt on solid ground rather than comfortable illusions. The Mitchell family's Thanksgiving celebration had been cancelled, and the reason behind those closed doors had been more complicated and devastating than anyone could have imagined. But in the wreckage of secrets and lies, they had found something unexpected, the